5 days before Christmas, my mother called to tell me not to come home. Not because of a fight, not because I'd done something unforgivable, not because we'd had one of those dramatic family blow-ups that leave people slamming doors and blocking numbers. She called because my sister was bringing her fiancé to Christmas Eve dinner, and my restaurant job might embarrass her. "Scarlett," my mother said carefully, like she was stepping across thin ice. "Victoria is introducing Daniel to everyone properly this year. His family is very established. We just don't want anything awkward." "A restaurant is awkward?" I asked. "It's not that," she rushed. "It's just image matters. Daniel's building something important. Investors, partnerships, you know how these circles work." I did know how those circles worked. I just didn't think my own family would try to push me out of one. "So, it's better if I don't come," I said. A pause, then relief in her voice. "Just this year, honey. We want everything to go smoothly." I looked out the window of my office in South End, Charlotte, at the lunch crowd lining up outside my flagship location. "I understand," I said. 4 days later, in a ballroom filled with 300 people, my name would echo across crystal chandeliers, and the man they were trying to impress would finally realize exactly who I was. But that afternoon, I just sat there holding my phone, listening to the quiet hum of the kitchen beyond my office door. Hayes Table and Company didn't look embarrassing to me. It looked like 6 fully operational locations across Charlotte. It looked like 73 employees whose paychecks cleared because I signed them. It looked like $4.6 million in annual revenue and a net profit north of $600,000. It looked like a community outreach program that fed more people on Christmas Eve than my parents' dining table ever would. But to Victoria, it was still opening a restaurant. To my parents, it was still the risky thing I did instead of becoming something respectable. "How's the restaurant?" my mother would ask every Sunday. Not which location, not how many employees, not how expansion was going, just the restaurant. Meanwhile, Victoria would talk about her corporate litigation cases, mergers worth millions, clients with last names that sounded like law firms themselves. My father would lean forward, fascinated. My mother would glow like she'd personally argued those cases. When it was my turn, I learned to answer in one sentence. "It's good." Conversation moved on. 12 years of that, 12 years of building quietly. I set my phone down and pulled up my calendar. December 24th was blocked in bold, full reservations, all locations. Community outreach, noon. We would serve more than 200 meals that day to families who couldn't afford a holiday dinner. Embarrassing. My phone buzzed again. A group text from Victoria. A photo appeared on my screen, her left hand resting on Daniel Carter's tailored jacket, her diamond catching Christmas lights. "First Christmas as future Mrs. Carter," she wrote. A red heart emoji followed. My parents replied within seconds. "So proud of you. Beautiful couple." No one tagged me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Daniel Carter, real estate developer, 5-story boutique hotel under construction in Uptown Charlotte. Investors from Atlanta and New York flying in next week for a black tie gala hosted by the Charlotte Entrepreneurs Association. I knew a little about that hotel. Actually, I knew quite a lot. Earlier that fall, when Carter Development Group announced they were seeking a food and beverage partner for the property, I had submitted a proposal through Hayes Hospitality Group, the parent company I'd formed 2 years ago. I signed it S. Hayes. The proposal detailed our 6 locations, our revenue, our operational systems, our training program, our vendor network, our community branding. Daniel had sat across from me in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the skyline and evaluated my projections without ever once connecting me to his fiancée's sister. He had called me Ms. Hayes. 2 weeks later, he signed a memorandum of understanding worth $1.2 million over 5 years. food and beverage operations for the Carter Boutique Hotel, launching in 2026. He still had no idea, and apparently, neither did Victoria. I stood and walked out of my office into the kitchen. Stainless steel gleamed under overhead lights. My executive chef was reviewing holiday specials with the line cooks. "Everything good?" he asked. "Everything's good," I said. And it was. The truth was, I wasn't hurt the way they probably expected me to be. I wasn't crying over a dining table I'd been pushed away from. I was thinking about optics. If I didn't go to Christmas Eve dinner, Daniel would shake my father's hand, sit in my chair, and never know that the hospitality partner he'd just secured was the same woman his fiancé thought was socially inconvenient. And 4 days after Christmas, he would sit in a ballroom with my parents and Victoria at his VIP table, the table he'd purchased to impress investors, while my name appeared on a screen behind a podium. Entrepreneur of the Year, Hospitality Sector. Finalist, Scarlett Hayes, founder and CEO, Hayes Table & Co. 6 locations, 4.6 million annual revenue. Strategic partnership secured with Carter Development Group. 2026 launch. I returned to my office and opened the reminder email from the gala committee. Black tie attire required. Finalist bios will be displayed publicly. Public acknowledgement of major partnerships permitted during acceptance speech. I closed my laptop slowly. They didn't want me at Christmas dinner because my job might embarrass them. They had no idea what I was about to reveal. This wasn't about one Christmas. It had been building for 12 years. Every Sunday at 6 o'clock, we sat around the same mahogany dining table in my parents' house in Myers Park. Same chairs, same roast chicken or pot roast, same order of conversation. Victoria first. She would set her napkin on her lap and begin, almost casually. "So we closed the Henderson case this week. 8-figure exposure, settled favorably." My father would lean forward immediately. 8 figures? How did you structure it?" My mother would beam like she'd personally negotiated the settlement. Victoria would explain the strategy: opposing counsel, courtroom posture, last-minute leverage. She used words like liability and acquisition and regulatory compliance. My parents absorbed every syllable. Then there would be a pause, the polite pivot. "And you, Scarlett?" my mother would say. "How's the restaurant?" Not which one, not how many, not what we were planning next. Just the restaurant. "It's good," I would answer, and that would be enough to move the spotlight back to Victoria. It hadn't always been 6 locations. It started with 1. 12 years earlier, I signed a lease on a narrow brick storefront in Plaza Midwood. The space had peeling paint and a kitchen that barely passed inspection. I had 3 mismatched tables, a borrowed stove from a retiring diner owner, and a second-hand refrigerator that hummed like it was warning me not to trust it. The night before opening, I stood alone in that empty room, holding the lease agreement, and wondering if I'd just ruined my life. Restaurants fail all the time. My father had said that when I told them I'd signed the lease. "Food is risky," he'd warned. "Margins are thin. You're a smart girl, Scarlett. You could have done something more stable." Victoria had laughed lightly. "At least we'll get free meals out of it." I'd laughed too. It was easier than defending a dream no one took seriously. The first year was brutal. I worked open to close. I handled inventory, payroll, marketing, and dishes. I burned myself more times than I can count. I slept in that kitchen twice during the first month because I couldn't afford a late-night ride home. When I told my parents I'd broken even by month 9, my mother smiled kindly. "That's nice, honey." Then she turned to Victoria and asked about a new firm partner. By year 3, I opened a second location in South End. It had real lighting, real branding, a line out the door on weekends. At Sunday dinner, I mentioned it. "We opened another location," I said. "That's ambitious," my father replied cautiously. "Make sure you're not overextending." Victoria chimed in. Scaling too fast can be dangerous. Even law firms expand strategically. I nodded and took a bite of mashed potatoes. I didn't tell them about the catering contract I'd just secured with a tech startup worth $500,000 over 3 years. I didn't tell them about the private dining program that was bringing in corporate clients with expense accounts larger than most households' yearly income, because they weren't asking. By year 5, I had 30 employees. 30 families, depending on a business my own family still referred to as the restaurant. When I mentioned hiring a human resources manager, my mother blinked in surprise. For a restaurant? Yes, I said evenly. For a company. Victoria's engagement dinner had been the first time I realized how deeply I'd been reduced. It was held at an upscale steakhouse overlooking the city skyline. Daniel Carter had just announced his boutique hotel development in Uptown Charlotte. 5 stories, luxury rooms, curated experience branding. Investors were at the table. So were partners and 2 of Victoria's colleagues. When Daniel turned to me politely and asked what I did, Victoria answered before I could. She runs a little restaurant, she said, smiling brightly. Little. The word slid across the table like something sticky. I corrected her gently. 6 locations, actually. Daniel raised his eyebrows slightly. That's impressive. Victoria squeezed his arm. It's mostly neighborhood spots. Very casual. Very casual. Later that night, I stepped outside for air and overheard Victoria speaking to Daniel near the valet stand. She's sweet, Victoria said, but she's not exactly the face of our family. I stood still in the shadows until they walked away. That was the night I stopped trying to translate my success into language they would respect. Instead, I built quietly. 2 years ago, I formed Hayes Hospitality Group as a parent entity. Separate brand identity, separate corporate structure, strategic expansion beyond standalone restaurants. No one in my family knew it existed. When my mother told me not to come to Christmas because my restaurant job might embarrass Victoria, I realized something. They weren't rejecting who I had become. They were clinging to who they thought I still was. The girl with 3 tables and a borrowed stove. Not the woman managing $4.6 million in annual revenue. Not the CEO overseeing 73 employees. Not the operator who had just signed a memorandum of understanding worth $1.2 million to run the food and beverage operations of a luxury hotel. That same hotel Victoria bragged about at dinner. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. The Sunday after my mother's phone call, I skipped dinner for the first time in years. Instead, I stayed late at the Uptown location reviewing year-end numbers, profit margins strong, staff retention higher than industry average, holiday reservations fully booked. My phone buzzed with a reminder from the gala committee. Finalist bios due by midnight. I opened the draft and read my own name. Scarlett Hayes, founder and CEO, Hayes Table & Co. 6 locations across Charlotte. $4.6 million in annual revenue, 73 employees, community outreach serving hundreds weekly, strategic partnership secured with Carter Development Group. I hovered over the partnership line for a moment. Then, I left it in. They didn't want me at their Christmas table because they thought I didn't fit the image. In a few days, that image was going to shift, whether they were ready or not. I saw the headline about Daniel's hotel on a Tuesday morning in early September. Carter Development Group breaks ground on luxury boutique hotel in Uptown Charlotte. 5 stories, rooftop lounge, curated guest experience. Select hospitality partner to be announced soon. I was in my office at the South End location, reviewing quarterly performance reports when I clicked the article. Daniel stood in the photo holding a ceremonial shovel, Victoria at his side, both of them smiling like the skyline belonged to them. The article mentioned they were seeking a sophisticated food and beverage operator capable of handling high-end clientele. Sophisticated. I leaned back in my chair and read the line again. For years, I had listened to Victoria talk about sophistication like it was a degree you earned in a courtroom, as if running a dining room at full capacity on a Saturday night wasn't its own kind of precision. as if managing 73 employees across 6 locations didn't require strategic discipline. I closed the article and opened a different folder on my laptop. Hayes Hospitality Group. I had formed the entity 2 years earlier without telling anyone outside my executive team. It wasn't secrecy for drama, it was insulation. When you're introduced as someone's little sister long enough, you learn the value of neutral ground. Hayes Hospitality Group existed to expand beyond neighborhood perception. Corporate partnerships, institutional contracts, development collaborations. No little restaurant baggage. Just performance metrics and operational capacity. I pulled up the RFP guidelines Carter Development Group had posted for potential F&B partners. Projected opening date, Spring 2026. Desired attributes, scalable operations, luxury service training, community integration branding. I smiled. We had already built all of that. I spent the next week assembling the proposal personally. Executive summary outlining 6 operational locations across Charlotte. $4.6 million in annual revenue. Staff training protocols with measurable performance benchmarks. Vendor relationships with regional farms and specialty suppliers. Projected F&B revenue streams for the hotel. Conservative modeling, steady growth, rooftop event premium margins. I signed the cover letter simply. S. Hayes, founder and CEO, Hayes Hospitality Group. 2 days after submission, I received an email. Carter Development Group would like to schedule a presentation. The meeting was held in their uptown office on the 22nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Tryon Street. Floor-to-ceiling windows, long conference table, minimalist art on the walls. Daniel was already seated when I entered. He looked up politely. There was a flicker of recognition, but not enough to connect dots. "Ms. Hayes," he said, standing to shake my hand. Professional, controlled, no trace of Victoria's sister. I took my seat across from him and his board. He opened the meeting by outlining his vision. Elevated but approachable. Boutique but profitable. A property that would attract affluent travelers without alienating the local market. When he finished, he leaned back slightly. "Your proposal is impressive," he said. "But can your company handle luxury clientele at scale?" There it was, the doubt, carefully wrapped. "Yes," I answered calmly. "We already do." I detailed our private dining program, our corporate catering contracts, our high-profile client events. I walked them through service training metrics and retention rates. One of the board members nodded slowly as I spoke. Daniel asked about supply chain reliability. I explained our redundancy vendors and contract safeguards. He asked about seasonal fluctuation. I showed projections accounting for occupancy dips. By the end of the presentation, the skepticism in the room had shifted, not eliminated, just replaced with evaluation. 2 weeks later, I received the call. Hayes Hospitality Group had been selected as the preferred F&B operator for the Carter Boutique Hotel. The Memorandum of Understanding was sent over for review. $1.2 million over 5 years. Full operational oversight for all food and beverage outlets within the property. Public announcement scheduled for early 2026, with optional mention permitted at the Charlotte Entrepreneurs Association Gala, pending award outcomes. I signed electronically as S. Hayes. Daniel's signature appeared beneath mine minutes later. He still didn't know. A week after signing, we were all back at my parents' dining table for Sunday dinner. Victoria was animated, describing wedding venues and floral consultations. Daniel spoke about the hotel's construction timeline and investor enthusiasm. My father listened with admiration. "It's going to change uptown," he said. "It will," Daniel replied confidently. Victoria glanced at me as she cut her chicken. "Daniel's looking for serious partners," she said lightly. "Not hobby businesses." The table went quiet for half a second. I sipped my water. Serious partner. The man praising serious partnerships had already signed with me. No one at that table knew. Daniel continued discussing projected occupancy rates and rooftop lounge concepts. My mother smiled proudly at Victoria. I wondered if they would still consider my business a hobby when my logo was displayed in his hotel lobby. A few days later, the gala committee emailed finalists requesting updated bios. I reread mine before submitting. Scarlett Hayes, founder and CEO, Hayes Table & Co., 6 locations across Charlotte, 4.6 million annual revenue, 73 employees, community outreach serving hundreds weekly, strategic partnerships secured with Carter Development Group. I hesitated over the last line. I could remove it, avoid complications, avoid spectacle. Instead, I left it exactly as written. Later that evening, Victoria texted me out of nowhere. Daniel's investors will be at the gala. Let's keep things smooth. Smooth, as if I were the variable, as if my presence required management. I didn't respond. Instead, I looked at the signed memorandum saved in my secure drive. S. Hayes. The same signature Daniel would soon connect to the woman he'd been told was socially inconvenient. They were worried I might embarrass them at Christmas. What they didn't realize was that I had already reshaped their future in a conference room overlooking the city. And in a few days, under ballroom lights, the rest of the room would learn it too. Christmas Eve arrived quietly. No frantic packing of gifts, no careful selection of a dress that would make me look polished but not threatening, no rehearsing neutral answers to questions about the restaurant. Instead, my alarm went off at 6, and I rolled out of bed knowing every one of my locations was fully booked. All 6. I made coffee in my uptown condo and stood at the window watching early light stretch across Charlotte's skyline. Somewhere across town, my parents were probably setting out polished silverware and lighting candles for a dinner I had been politely excluded from. My phone buzzed before I could overthink it. Family group chat. Victoria had sent a photo. Her hand rested on Daniel's tuxedo sleeve, her engagement ring sparkling under warm Christmas lights. My parents stood behind them in front of the tree, smiling like this was the cover of a holiday catalog. "First Christmas as future Mrs. Carter," she wrote. My mother replied with 3 heart emojis. My father followed with, "So proud of you." I wasn't tagged. I stared at the empty space where my chair would have been at their dining table. Then I set my phone down and grabbed my coat. By 7:30, I was at the South End location. The restaurant glowed with understated holiday decor, evergreen garlands, soft white lights, nothing excessive. The kitchen already hummed with energy. My executive chef was reviewing prep lists while 2 line cooks chopped herbs in steady rhythm. "Morning, boss," he said. "Morning. We good?" "Fully booked until 9 tonight." "Good." The dining room staff filtered in one by one, some carrying wrapped gifts for Secret Santa exchanges. Someone had set a tray of homemade cookies in the break room with a card that read, "For the Hayes Table family." Family. That word felt different here. Around 11, one of my servers handed me a thick envelope. "We all chipped in," she said shyly. Inside was a handwritten card signed by almost everyone on payroll. "Thank you for building this." I swallowed hard. 73 employees. 73 households relying on the decisions I made. Embarrassing. At noon, we closed the dining room temporarily for our annual community outreach meal. Volunteers lined up plates while our kitchen team moved in synchronized efficiency. Families filtered in, some familiar from previous years, others new. Kids stared wide-eyed at the dessert table. A woman with 2 small children approached me after they'd been seated. "Are you the owner?" she asked. "Yes." She squeezed my hand. "My kids look forward to this every Christmas. Thank you." I glanced at her children, who were already devouring warm rolls. I thought about my parents' dining table, about polished glassware and curated image. Here, there was no performance, just nourishment. Later that afternoon, during a brief lull between lunch and dinner service, I checked my phone again. Victoria had posted another photo. This time, the entire Christmas Eve table was visible. Daniel at the head, my father to his right, my mother beaming beside Victoria. The empty chair at the end, the one I always took, had been replaced with a tall centerpiece of white lilies. "Perfect Christmas Eve with the people who matter most," she captioned. I felt the sting for exactly 3 seconds. Then it passed. My phone buzzed again. A direct message from Victoria. "I hope you're not planning to show up at the gala and make things complicated." I read it twice. Then a second message followed. "Daniel's investors will be there. Let's keep things smooth." Smooth. As if I were turbulence. I locked my phone and slid it into my coat pocket. Dinner service began at 5. Every table filled, every seat occupied, couples celebrating quietly, groups of friends raising glasses, a private event in the back room with a local startup celebrating its year-end milestone. I moved between kitchen and floor, adjusting details, greeting guests, checking pacing. A man at table 12 asked about potential catering for a spring fundraiser. An older couple complimented the holiday pre-fix menu. My phone vibrated in my pocket, but I ignored it. At 8:30, between course transitions, I stepped into my office to check emails. One from the gala committee caught my eye. Final reminder, Entrepreneur of the Year. Hospitality sector presentation order confirmed. Sponsor recognition immediately precedes category announcement. Carter Development Group listed as sponsor. I leaned back in my chair. Sponsor recognition, meaning Daniel would stand, receive applause, bask in investor approval. Then the lights would dim, and my category would begin. I pictured Victoria sitting at that VIP table, convinced the narrative was under her control. I pictured Daniel scanning the program, proud of his strategic partnership. Neither of them knowing the partnership they were so eager to reference was mine. By 10, the dinner rush slowed. By 11, we closed the doors. I stood alone in the dim dining room, Christmas tree lights reflecting softly against polished wood floors. Staff had gone home. The kitchen was quiet for the first time all day. I ran numbers in my head automatically. 6 locations, 4.6 million in annual revenue, 1.2 million hotel partnerships secured, 73 employees, and one family who thought I was socially inconvenient. Snow began to fall outside, light and steady. I turned off the dining room lights and locked the doors. They celebrated Christmas without me. In 4 days, they would sit beneath chandeliers and hear my name announced in front of 300 people. And this time, there would be no centerpiece to replace me. The gala was held at the Meridian Hotel in Uptown Charlotte. 300 guests, black-tie dress code, a valet line that curved around the block with polished black sedans and imported SUVs. I parked my car myself, not because I couldn't afford valet, but because I liked arriving on my own terms. Inside the lobby, chandeliers reflected off marble floors. Women in silk gowns and men in tailored tuxedos clustered in small circles, laughing a little too loudly over champagne flutes. I checked my phone one last time. Carter Development Group. Table 4, VIP sponsor. Hayes Table and Company, Table 11, nominee. I slipped my phone into my clutch and walked into the ballroom. Gold table settings, crystal centerpieces, a raised stage with a massive screen behind the podium displaying the Charlotte Entrepreneurs Association logo. And there they were. Victoria in a fitted ivory gown, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. Daniel in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, scanning the room with investor confidence. My parents seated beside them at the sponsor table, clearly aware they were in the VIP section. My father adjusted his cufflinks. My mother leaned in close to Victoria, whispering something that made her smile. They hadn't seen me yet. I found my seat at table 11 with the other finalists. A tech founder, a manufacturing executive, a woman who'd scaled a wellness brand across the Southeast. We exchanged polite congratulations. "Hospitality sector?" the tech founder asked me. "Yes." "That's a tough industry," he said. "It is," I replied calmly. Cocktail hour flowed into dinner. From across the room, I heard Daniel speaking animatedly to two men in dark suits. "We secured a serious hospitality partner," he said. "Operational depth, scalable model." Victoria nodded beside him, glowing. "Serious partner." I took a slow sip of water. At 7:15, the lights dimmed. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed the room. Sponsors were thanked first. Applause rolled through the ballroom as names were called. "Carter Development Group," the MC announced. Spotlight shifted to Table 4. Daniel stood, buttoning his jacket. Victoria followed his lead. My parents rose slightly in their seats, proud by association. Polite applause swelled. Daniel shook hands with the MC before returning to his table. The lights dimmed again. "Next category," the MC said, smiling. "Entrepreneur of the Year, Hospitality Sector." My pulse slowed instead of racing. This was the part that mattered. The first finalist appeared on the screen. Applause. The second. Applause. Then the third slide illuminated the massive screen behind the podium. Scarlett Hayes, founder and CEO, Hayes Table & Co. 6 locations across Charlotte. 4.6 million annual revenue. 73 employees. Community outreach serving hundreds weekly. Strategic partnership secured with Carter Development Group. 2026 launch. I didn't look at Table 4 right away, but I felt the shift. The applause was polite at first, then stronger as people recognized the brand. I glanced across the room. Victoria's smile had frozen. Daniel leaned forward, reading the screen carefully. His hand reached for the printed program at his place setting. My father squinted toward the stage. My mother's champagne glass hovered halfway to her lips. Daniel flipped through the booklet, scanning quickly. I saw his finger stop at the partnership line. He looked up at me. Not politely, not casually, directly. The envelope was opened on stage. A pause. "Entrepreneur of the Year, Hospitality Sector, Scarlett Hayes." The applause this time wasn't polite. It was loud. I stood slowly. My chair scraped softly against the ballroom floor as I stepped into the aisle. 300 faces turned toward me. I walked toward the stage without rushing. 20 feet from Table 4, I allowed myself one look. Daniel's expression had shifted from confusion to calculation. Victoria's jaw tightened. My father had gone completely still. I climbed the steps. The crystal award was heavier than I expected when it was placed in my hands. Cameras flashed. I turned toward the microphone. "I started with 3 tables and a borrowed stove," I began. The room quieted. "I didn't start with investors. I didn't start with a trust fund. I started with a belief that if you feed people with care, they come back." I let that settle. Over the past 12 years, we've grown to 6 locations, employing 73 people across this city. We serve more than meals. We serve opportunity. I paused, shifting my weight slightly. And this year, we signed a long-term partnership to lead food and beverage operations for one of Uptown Charlotte's most anticipated boutique hotels. A subtle murmur rippled through the ballroom. "That partnership begins in 2026, I added calmly. I didn't say Daniel's name. I didn't have to. I finished by thanking my staff, my executive team, and the community. Applause surged again, stronger this time. As I stepped off stage, a journalist intercepted me. "Ms. Hayes, can you comment on the Carter partnership?" "It's a strategic alignment," I said evenly. "We're excited about what we're building." Building. I hadn't built this moment for revenge, but I wasn't going to shrink from it either. When I turned, Daniel was standing a few feet away. "You're S. Hayes," he said quietly. "Yes." His jaw flexed. "Why didn't you say something?" "You never asked," I replied. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Behind him, Victoria approached, smile brittle. "This is all just optics. she said too brightly. We didn't realize. Daniel turned to her. You told me she ran a small cafe. Victoria's expression flickered. I didn't think the scale mattered, she said. It matters, he replied flatly. My parents hovered a few steps behind them, visibly unsettled. Victoria tried again. This doesn't have to be dramatic. Daniel looked at her for a long second. Then he said quietly, I need air. He walked away toward the hallway outside the ballroom. Victoria stood frozen. 10 minutes passed. 15. Daniel didn't return. When Victoria finally came back to the table alone, her engagement ring was no longer on her finger. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father looked between them, confused. I didn't feel triumph. I felt inevitability. Daniel approached me once more before leaving the venue. Business continues as planned, he said, separate from everything else. Of course, I answered. He nodded once and walked away. My father stepped toward me slowly. We didn't know, he said. You didn't ask, I replied. My mother reached for me as if to hug me publicly. I stepped back gently. You were worried I'd embarrass you, I said quietly. Tonight, you were proud to sit at that table. Neither of them argued. I left the ballroom before the final award was announced. Outside, the cold air hit my face as I walked toward my car, Crystal Award tucked securely under my arm. My phone buzzed with notifications. One headline preview caught my eye. Hayes Hospitality secures major Carter hotel deal. Public. Permanent. They excluded me from Christmas to protect their image. Tonight, I didn't expose them. I exposed the truth. The first email arrived the morning after the gala. Subject line: We owe you an apology. It was from my father. I read it sitting at the small conference table in my office before the staff arrived. Scarlett, I don't know how to begin this. Watching you on that stage last night made me realize how little I understood about what you've built. That's on me. I assumed. I minimized. I never asked the right questions. I am proud of you. I should have said that years ago. Dad. He hadn't signed an email, Dad, in a long time. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and stared at the wall where framed photos of our restaurants lined the shelves. Opening day crowds, staff celebrations, community outreach nights. Proof had always been there. They just hadn't looked. At 10:30, my mother texted, Can we talk? In person? I didn't respond right away. I had payroll to review, vendor contracts to finalize, a call scheduled with our design team for the hotel rooftop lounge. Life hadn't paused for their revelation. At noon, Victoria called. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered on the 4th ring. What? She said immediately, skipping hello. Good afternoon to you too. This is a mess, Scarlett. For who? For me, she snapped. Daniel walked out of the gala. Do you have any idea what that did to my reputation? I leaned back in my chair. You told him I ran a small cafe. It wasn't relevant. It was, I said calmly. It shaped how he saw me and how you saw me. She exhaled sharply. You didn't have to make it public. I didn't make anything public, I replied. The partnership was real. The award was real. You just didn't know. Silence crackled between us. You embarrassed me, she said finally. I almost laughed. You didn't invite me to Christmas because you were embarrassed by me. That was different. No, I said softly. It wasn't. She didn't have a response to that. When she hung up, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not anger, not satisfaction. Relief. The following day, I agreed to meet my mother for coffee. Morning Grounds Cafe in Dilworth. Neutral territory. She was already seated when I walked in, hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug. She looked smaller than I remembered from the ballroom, less polished, less certain. "Hi, honey," she said. "Hi." We sat in silence for a moment. "I didn't know," she began quickly. "I didn't know it was that big." "That's the problem," I said evenly. "You never tried to know." Her eyes filled immediately. "I wanted you to have security," she said. "Respect. I thought law and real estate were stable. Food felt risky." "It is risky," I said. "So is everything worth building." She swallowed. "When Victoria said Daniel was nervous about your job," she continued quietly, "I thought maybe it would be easier for one night. Just one night without tension. So, you removed me." She flinched. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "You did?" I said. The word landed heavily between us. She reached across the table, hesitated, then let her hand rest on the surface instead. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Truly." "Are you proud of what I built?" I asked, "or proud because the ballroom applauded?" That hurt her. "I'm proud of you," she repeated, more quietly. We sat there for almost an hour. I didn't offer immediate forgiveness. She didn't demand it. Before we left, I said, "If we rebuild this, it's going to look different." She nodded quickly. "Anything." "You don't get to decide when I'm convenient," I said. "You don't get to minimize my work, and you don't get to compare me to Victoria like we're competing for approval." Her shoulders dropped. "Okay." "Not okay like you're agreeing to keep peace," I added. "Okay like you understand." She met my eyes. "I understand." Later that week, Daniel requested a meeting. Not at his office. At the construction site of the hotel. Hard hats. Dust. Steel beams rising against the winter sky. He approached me with a folder tucked under his arm. "I want to be clear," he said. "Our partnership stands, professionally." "It always did," I replied. He nodded. "I didn't know how Victoria described you." "I know." He hesitated. "She called you the embarrassing family member." I didn't react. "I assumed," he continued, "that you were small scale. That's on me." "It's on both of you," I said calmly. He exhaled. "The wedding is postponed," he added. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "For now," he clarified. "There are differences in values." I didn't comment. We walked through the unfinished lobby together, discussing layout flow and service access points like nothing else existed, because professionally, nothing else did. That night, my father called. Not texted, called. "I was wrong," he said without preamble. "I measured success in titles I understood." "And now?" I asked. "Now I see what you built." There was no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic hug, just acknowledgement, which, strangely, felt heavier. Over the next few weeks, the media coverage continued. Articles about the partnership, profiles on my business trajectory, invitations to speak at local panels. My parents began forwarding the links to extended family. "Have you seen this?" My mother texted one afternoon. I replied simply, "Yes." One evening, as I closed up the South End location, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked the same as I had at Christmas. Same hands, same posture. The difference wasn't my success. It was their perception. They had spent years seeing me as smaller because it made their narrative comfortable. Now that narrative had cracked. I hadn't set out to humiliate anyone. I had simply refused to shrink. And that, apparently, was enough to change everything. Christmas came again a year later, but this time the invitations had my name on them. Not to my parents' house. To mine. By then, the Carter Boutique Hotel was fully operational. 5 stories of glass and brick rising confidently over uptown Charlotte, its rooftop lounge already booked through spring. Hayes Hospitality Group managed every food and beverage outlet inside it: the ground floor brasserie, the private dining rooms, the rooftop bar. The logo at the entrance read, Hayes Table & Co. in understated gold lettering. No one called it a little restaurant anymore. The Christmas party was held in the rooftop lounge. Soft jazz floated through the air, strings of warm lights reflected off the skyline, and floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in quiet winter glow. 200 guests moved through the space: investors, staff, community partners, media, and extended family. I stood near the entrance greeting arrivals. Miguel was beside me, steady as always. He had moved from lead chef to director of culinary operations over the past year, a promotion he'd earned without theatrics. "You ready?" he asked softly. "I've been ready for 12 years, I replied. My parents arrived first. My mother stepped out of the elevator looking nervous, scanning the room before her eyes landed on me. She smiled, not the polished society smile she wore at the gala, but something smaller and real. "You did this," she said as she took in the room. "Yes." My father shook my hand before pulling me into a brief hug. "This place is incredible," he said. I nodded toward the bar where a line of guests waited for signature cocktails designed by our team. "Welcome to Christmas," I said. They moved further into the room, mingling awkwardly at first. I watched them carefully, not with suspicion, but with awareness. They weren't performing pride this time. They were adjusting. Victoria arrived 30 minutes later, alone. No diamond ring, no Daniel at her side. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with a composure that felt practiced. When she saw me, she hesitated. "Scarlett," she said. "Victoria." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she stepped forward. "This is impressive," she said, glancing around. "Thank you." She cleared her throat. "I heard the rooftop bookings are at capacity." "They are." She nodded slowly. "I didn't realize how big this was," she said finally. "You didn't want to," I replied, not unkindly. She didn't argue. Instead, she looked out at the crowd. "I've been telling clients about your hospitality group," she admitted. "Corporate events, retreats." I studied her face. "That's new." "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." The band shifted into a softer melody. Waitstaff moved seamlessly between tables carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres designed by Miguel's team. The service was precise, elegant, efficient. 73 employees had become over 100 across divisions. Every one of them knew tonight mattered. Not because my family was there, but because this space represented growth none of us had imagined 12 years ago. Later in the evening, my father approached me near the edge of the terrace. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's dangerous," I teased lightly. He smiled faintly. "I used to believe stability meant titles, law, finance, real estate, things I understood. And now? Now I see you built something just as powerful. I just didn't know how to measure it." "You don't need to measure it," I said. "You just need to respect it." He nodded. "I do." Inside, my mother was speaking with one of our managers about employee training programs. She listened carefully, asking real questions. Not surface-level curiosity, actual engagement. Victoria found me again near the dessert station. "I wanted to say something," she began. I waited. "I was threatened," she admitted. "You didn't need the things I needed. Approval, applause, structure." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "You think I didn't need approval?" She exhaled. "I mean, you built without it." That landed differently. I built because I loved it, I said. Not because I was trying to outrun you. She nodded slowly. Daniel and I ended things, she added quietly. I know. He said we valued status differently. I didn't respond. For the first time in our lives, there was no competition in her tone, just recognition. As the night deepened, I took the microphone briefly. Thank you all for being here, I said. This year has been transformative for our company, for our community, and for me personally. The room quieted. 12 years ago, I opened a small space with 3 tables and a borrowed stove. Tonight, we host this celebration in a hotel where our team runs every kitchen. Soft laughter rippled. I've learned that sometimes the people closest to you won't understand what you're building, not because they don't care, but because they can't see it yet. I glanced toward my parents. And that's okay, because if you keep building with integrity, eventually they'll have no choice but to see. Applause rose gently, not explosive, but sincere. When I stepped down from the microphone, my mother hugged me without hesitation. I see it now, she whispered. I know, I said. Later, as guests filtered out and the skyline shimmered beyond the glass, Victoria approached once more. I'm proud of you, she said. It sounded unfamiliar coming from her. Thank you, I replied. Not sarcastic, not guarded, just steady. After everyone left, I stood alone for a moment, in the center of the rooftop lounge. The city lights reflected in the glass. Staff cleaned quietly in the background. Miguel caught my eye from across the room and gave a small nod. 1 year ago, I wasn't invited to Christmas. Tonight, I hosted it. Not to prove a point, but because I no longer needed their permission to take up space. I hadn't just opened restaurants. I had built position. And this time, when they asked about my work, I answered, not to defend it, but because they were finally ready to listen. The year after that, Christmas felt different again. Not dramatic, not tense, just steady. By then, Hayes Hospitality Group had expanded into 2 additional properties outside Charlotte. The Uptown Hotel was outperforming projections, and our rooftop lounge had become one of the most requested private event spaces in the city. Growth no longer surprised me. Silence no longer defined me. On a quiet afternoon in early December, I sat in my office reviewing expansion plans when my phone rang. Victoria, I answered. Are you busy? She asked. Always, I said lightly. What's up? I have a client hosting a corporate retreat in March, she said. They're looking for full hospitality coordination. I recommended you. I paused. You recommended me? Yes. There was no edge in her voice, no competition, just business. Send the details, I said. I will. Before hanging up, she added, I should have seen you sooner. I didn't respond to that, because sometimes acknowledgement doesn't need commentary. Later that week, my parents came by the Uptown property for lunch. Not a tour, not a special event, just lunch. They waited in line like everyone else. When they reached the counter, my mother looked at the menu board with genuine interest. What's new this season? She asked. I smiled. Come sit, I'll tell you. Over salads and coffee, my father asked about vendor negotiations. My mother asked about employee training programs. Not to judge, to understand. The questions felt different now. There was no comparison to Victoria, no subtle hierarchy, just curiosity. At one point, my father looked around the dining room, watching the staff move with coordinated precision. You built all this, he said quietly. Yes. He nodded slowly. I was wrong to measure success by what I understood. I leaned back in my chair. You weren't wrong to want security for me, I said. You were wrong to assume it only came in one form. He absorbed that. Growth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the absence of dismissal. On Christmas Eve that year, I didn't host an event. I didn't attend a gala. I cooked a simple dinner at home. Miguel came over. My parents joined us. Victoria arrived with a bottle of wine. No investors, no sponsors, no performance. At one point during dinner, Victoria looked at me across the table. "Remember when I said you ran a little restaurant?" she asked. I laughed softly. "I remember." She shook her head. I don't know why that felt safer to say. "Because if I was small," I replied gently, "you didn't have to reevaluate yourself." She didn't argue, and for the first time in our lives, the air between us didn't feel competitive. It felt balanced. Later that night, after everyone left, I stood in my kitchen rinsing plates. 12 years, 3 tables, borrowed stove, 6 restaurants, a hospitality group, a hotel partnership, 1 gala, 1 broken engagement, and a family that finally asked instead of assumed. They had once excluded me from Christmas to protect their image. Now they showed up because they respected mine. I didn't win because I embarrassed them. I didn't win because I exposed them. I won because I stopped shrinking. Because I built quietly. Because I refused to let their misunderstanding define my worth. And if you're listening to this right now, maybe you know that feeling. Maybe you've been the one at the table who gets the polite question. The one whose work gets summarized into something smaller than it is. The one told to tone it down so someone else can look bigger. Here's what I learned. You don't have to fight for a seat at their table. Build your own. And when they finally knock on your door, decide whether you open it. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or quietly written off, tell me in the comments. I read them. I see you. And if you want more stories about turning family drama into quiet power, about betrayal, reputation, and the moment the tables turn, stay with this channel. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's building something so undeniable they can't look away. And sometimes the best payback is simply becoming everything they said you couldn't be.